Great.
So we're going to turn to the audience, and first I'm going to give up my chair so I can stretch out and welcome Graham Wrigley up to here. I've kept it warm for you. Graham is the CDC's group's chairman, and one of the reasons we're welcoming Graham up here for the audience Q&A is that I think one of the things that actually this event and your leadership is projecting is a strong desire for both engagement and accountability for the CDC as you launch this new strategy, which I think everybody applauds. So thank you for joining us. So I'm going to offer, we have in our very own house here, Dirk Willem Teveld, who is one of the world's leading experts on the issues that we've been talking about tonight, has a great blog out today talking about the strategy and some of the questions we need to ask. So Dirk, I wanted to offer the first question to you. And let me just say overall that if you have a question that is specific for a panel member, please say that and ask your question. And if it's a general question, that's okay too. If you have a comment, that's okay also, but keep it extremely brief, hopefully followed by a question. Dirk.
Well, thank you very much, Alex. My name is Dirk Teveld of ODI, and congratulations, Nick, on your new position. I've watched CDC for a number of years now, and I'm a big fan of CDC and also development finance institutions more generally, and I think they play an important role in the development finance architecture more generally. I've seen it evolve with the CDC reform a couple of years ago, become more concentrated in particular countries, also adding more instruments, finance instruments to the arsenal of how you can invest. And you're right to emphasize, of course, the continuity in this strategy. But I also would like to sort of say that this is not business as usual, at least the way I've read this strategy, in that CDC and DFIs used to come from this obscurity. We didn't know much about DFIs. They were investing in individual projects. But now you want to think about global goals and how DFIs can contribute to the global goals. And you are actually saying in the strategy, you are going to invest to transform whole sectors. And I think that the chairman was saying in his foreword about we're going to solve market and sector problems. And that is a different focus, I think, or at least an additional focus than thinking only about individual projects. So my question really is about how do you see this stepping up in the coming 5 years? How do you see you coming from individual projects to really thinking about sector problems? How is CDC going to become much more visible in development policy, and not just here, but in developing countries as well? How are you going to work with public sector officials, with NGOs, with academia, with business there to solve sector problems?
Good question. Why don't we start with that and then we'll open up. Go ahead.
No, I think it's a good question, and obviously sector strategies become a much more important part of how we're organised at CDC, even in the last couple of years, in terms of, as we consider the investments we've made over the last 2 years. And I mean, there's a very good paper actually by the Tony Blair Institute that I read about a week or two ago, which talked about the challenges of job creation in Africa, and talked about the importance of governments pursuing intelligent sector strategies to address, identify what you're good at and make sure you invest in that. I think CDC's role, we've articulated and laid out in this document seven core sectors. I think within each sector we need to clearly define what we see as sort of the future growth of the sector. What needs to happen in those sectors, in which countries, to really be really transformational. So that idea of historically we've done sort of sector mappings where we look at who's in the sector right now. I think we need to be much more forward-looking and think in terms of thinking of a real sector strategy. And I think importantly also work with DFID as a key stakeholder, because I've been visiting all these countries in Africa, and everywhere I go I meet a DFID representative, and everywhere they're making significant commitments, grant commitments, to supporting the growth of private development, of the private sector. So we need to make sure that we're partnering. Lots of the sort of regulatory issues that get in the way of successful private sector development can be addressed in partnership with DFID. So it's that sort of it's having a sector strategy, understanding where you're trying to get to, understanding what are the barriers, understanding whether you can solve those or whether you need to partner with the DFID, or drawing on, as I said in my remarks, the information that's in this room and from the NGO community.
Rachel, do you just want to say something about how DFID is or plans to align with CDC investments to achieve what Nick is talking about?
Yeah, I think Nick has said pretty clearly that we're really going to step up this flow of information between us, both here but also out in the developing countries. And particularly, we're absolutely hungry as DFID to hear a lot more from CDC about the constraints to investment. What are the things that need solving, not at the enterprise level, not at the sector platform level, if you like, but actually in working in partnership with government. And we made a commitment in our new economic development strategy that a lot of the work we're doing on regulatory reform, economic reform with governments, that we would take a lot of that closer to the investor. And in fact, we had a discussion around that in this room a couple of weeks ago about how important it is to really build up those actions on reform, really listening tightly to investors. So we're really going to step up.
Great. Let's invite a few more questions over here. If you could identify yourself and where you work, that'd be great. Thanks.
Hi, my name is Vila Cavaliero and I'm with Action Aid UK.
I'm not sure are we getting the sound?
Is it just
For the
I don't know. Go ahead. Sorry.
Okay, I'll just carry on.
Oh,
Great.
there you go.
So my name is Vila Cavaliero and I'm with Action Aid UK, and I'm really pleased to see that women's economic empowerment is quite prominently in the strategy. We're really happy about that. But I just wondered whether I could ask a little bit more in detail what this is going to be like and how it's going to play out, and how it might be maybe in partnership with some of DFID's economic development strategy commitments towards gender. I'm particularly quite interested in hearing about that in terms of the quality of jobs that are available to women.
Great question. We're going to take a couple more over here.
Good afternoon, Luke Mann, Accenture Sustainability Strategy. Fantastic to see that the global goals are so prominently featured in the new strategy. My question then is, how are you actually going to make sure that they're incorporated at the company level, right where the rubber hits the road, and making the business case, and as opposed to, say, just some additional tick boxes and additional reporting burden? Thank you.
I think those are good interrelated questions. We'll take the third one here and then go back to the panel for responses.
Thank you. Dario Kenna from the policy team at CAFOD. Again, welcome the inclusion on quality jobs. I'm just wondering what indicators you might be using to measure those. And then also, it's good to see a reference to the ILO standards, but just wondering where the UN guiding principles on business and human rights appears and how that might link into CDC's work, in particular to mitigate risk and bad stories.
Thanks. So a little bit of a theme there, I think, in those questions. How do you account for things like gender rights and other things? How do you actually make it real at the investment level beyond rhetoric? And how do you measure that? Yeah. So and let me say, obviously, the panelists, all of you, feel free to jump in on any of those questions.
Yeah. So all very good questions. I don't want to and I'm not in any way dodging the question, but I do want to ask Ritu, who runs our environmental and social group, to perhaps answer some of those questions, because she's a lot more qualified to do it than I am. I would only say that one of the things on the gender question, one of the things that I learned at the Gates Foundation was gender is an issue that goes across everything, not just how many women you have or how many women you lend to. So I think using that gender lens in every discussion we have about how a company is being managed is a critical element of what we do. How we incorporate, and as I made the point before, how we incorporate these with the companies themselves, ensure they're happening. I do, as I made the point before, I think owners have significant opportunity in the role, the governance role they play to affect change, and so that's something that we take very seriously. and have ongoing, a significant team here in London, and ongoing regular dialogue with the companies to ensure that things they say are going to happen are actually happening. But I would like Ritu to give Ritu the opportunity, because she is a person that lives this every day.
Yeah, if you can briefly add to that, would be great.
So on the specific question relating to women's economic empowerment and the job quality for women, specifically in our investee companies, we have been looking at the women's issue in the past few years more on an opportunistic basis, wherever we find an opportunity to support and help women's economic empowerment, be it through financial inclusion programs or financial literacy programs, we do that. But what we have pledged to do in this new strategy is to really develop a very structured gender strategy, which will focus on women's economic empowerment. And, it's early days now. We have just started to develop that strategy. We have a dedicated gender lead within CDC who is working on it together with some advisors. And hopefully by the end of the year, we will have a much more structured program. In terms of, job quality, we look at it across the board, whether it's male or female job quality. And we follow the ILO conventions, but we are also, we have adopted the Modern Slavery Act of the UK government as part of our Code of Responsible Investing. So we look at, issues related to job quality very strategically. We look at health and safety of jobs, security of jobs, but we also recognize that we need to report more more regularly on this, and we are again working on a set of metrics which we will agree across the board within CDC and report on those in the sort of next 5-year strategy.
Dan, you have anything? I'm curious, you've been sitting for years now in a lot of these conversations about development finance between public and private. People like to talk about how their investments are going to have these other knock-on effects, but sometimes the bottom line is the bottom line. How have you seen organizations successfully actually make good on these sorts of commitments?
Well, I think the first thing, the great thing about the SDGs is I think it has been a real call to action to the private sector. So I think when they came out, we ran a global campaign to, I think everyone in the bank, all 100,000 of staff, had to go and tell at least 10 people about the SDGs and the commitment to it. And we're going through an exercise at the moment of sort of mapping out the SDGs and looking at how we can make commitments to those different areas. I think, if I'm just pivot a little bit into this area about women's empowerment, it's something also I think the private sector is incredibly committed to as a whole. We run a sort of financial literacy and inclusion process with underdeveloped girls in a lot of the fragile states through netball, where we deliver lessons. But I think the really critical importance of actually giving employment and access to finance is really critical here. And through our work with microfinance institutions, most of that financing goes into women as well. So I think you're seeing the private sector use the SDGs and other targets as a way of a lens of looking at what they're doing and how they can work with the likes of CDC and others.
I can just add one thing on gender within CDC itself. Sorry, can you hear me? Within CDC itself, and what you were saying, Daniel, we actually have somebody who's done some research coming to present to the board and all the staff, looking at women as investors. And she's done a lot of research to claims, and I think it's really exciting, showing that women are better investors than men. And it's something that it's not in the strategy, but we need to do more within CDC itself as an organisation over the next 5 years, as an organisation on gender.
Great. You want to say something, or should I go back?
Say something, just because the UK sat on the Secretary General's high-level panel on female economic empowerment that was launched last year, and the process of producing that report, and I hope that everybody's had a chance to look at it, was a very strong process to gather the evidence about what works and doesn't work in this space, and particularly in the private sector space. And we're firmly committed to the actions that were set out by the Secretary General and taking those forward. And that's very much what we're discussing with CDC. We launched last year a program called WOW, Women's Opportunities for Work, which is a specific program to work with business, with the private sector in developing countries, to really begin to both support initiatives but to continue to invest in the evidence base about what works. And we're absolutely going to be making sure that CDC are part of that and are picking up the learning from that.
Great. Another round of questions right here in front.
Thank you very much for a very informative panel. My name is Marini and I work with CARE. So in the strategy, you do mention the Africa list, which is looking at training the next generation of future leaders, leveraging CEOs in Africa. I wanted to find out, one, if there was a gender lens on this process, and two, how you were building intra-continental trade linkages between your investees, and how you were linking them into global supply chains as well. So moving beyond just fiscal resources from the private sector, but also skills transfer and routes to market. Thank you.
Yeah, okay, the gentleman right here.
Thank you very much. My name is Seri Mansour Guy. I'm the president of the Senegal UK Chamber of Commerce. So my question is, I was just wondering, what is the strategy for the CDC for Francophone Africa? Because we've noticed that you have a huge presence in Anglophone Africa, and most of the time people are asking me, what is your strategy for the area for Francophone Africa? Thank you.
Excellent question. And down in the end, this very handsome gentleman, sorry, right here. It's hard to say. You're both very handsome. But you're both very handsome. But one of you is on my board.
So I'm Sam Sharp. I work for Save the Children. But actually, I'm talking about this because I feel passionately about it, having worked in India for DFID a few years ago with CDC. I wanted to ask two questions. First, in comparison with the capital needs you're talking about, $1 billion of investment per year isn't actually that big a sum of money. And I wonder whether we could actually envisage CDC being bigger in a few years' time than is in your strategy. And it'd be really interesting to hear about that. But secondly, I always felt that the most difficult set of skills CDC had to deploy wasn't finding a great investment, wasn't finding a great partner. It was ensuring that the money was going to be used safely in a way that was protected from corruption and other risks of that kind. And that seemed to me an absolutely amazing set of skills that CDC had and developed. And I wondered, I didn't really see much about that in the strategy, but wondering whether you could say more about that. Thank you.
Interesting. Okay, a couple of diverse points there. And picking up on the first question that was asked, we had a report came out a little while ago about the age of choice, and the development finance actors have grown. One in particular has become quite a behemoth, China. They've announced a One Belt, One Road initiative that very much speaks to the aspirations, I think, that you articulated, that this isn't just about individual businesses, but actually fundamental, large-scale economic transformation that is more closer to trillions than it is to $1 billion. So I'm curious how CDC sees itself in that much more crowded, I'd like to think it's cooperative, maybe slightly competitive environment that you're engaged in. So Graham, you want to start?
If I take that question and then the last one and then you do the first two. So I think on the question of how do we see CDC in the global world of DFIs. CDC is the oldest DFI in the world, set up in 1948. But relative to the scale of the aid budget, compared to most of DFIs, we're actually the smallest. and that was laid out in some of the strategy document. I think that what's been happening over the last 5 years is, and this goes to Sam's question, has been a slow, thoughtful, and well-planned growth in CDC. So our commitment rate has gone up from $300 million a year to averaging, last year it was 1.6 billion. But averaging just over $1 billion, and that's been possible because we've slowly built up the team and the resources over the last 5 years, and we've known that this capital need was coming, and that led to the recapitalization in 2015 and the CDC Act this year. In terms of what we see and what is laid out in the strategy, we don't see a massive increase in investment rate from the level we're at the moment. Talked about it on average about £1.2 billion a year, plus another sum based on how successful we are in these new and innovative strategies. So to Sam's question, we don't see a massive change in scale from the size that we're operating at the moment over the next 5 years. It will have funding implications which will be resolved, as we said in Parliament, in a separate business case process later in this year. In terms of how do we see our role with other DFIs, and you, Alex, you put on a very thoughtful word about competitors. We don't think we have competitors. Our goal is development, and we have partners in the private sector and other DFIs to work together. And, over the last 5 years, we've worked increasingly collaboratively with DFIs. And I think it's incredibly important we're additional, as Nick said early on, both with respect to private capital, but also other DFIs.
Daniel, as I know this is a subject of interest to you, just on this question, when you look at what's happening, the financial flows, domestic resource mobilization, Chinese investment, all the things that are going on out there, does the amount of resources that is dedicated by the British government and through the CDC, does it have impact in that ground scale?
I don't think it's about money, is the short answer. I think if you look at development, and I sort of touched on some of these issues beforehand, it's not just about the amount of money out there. There's lots of money out there, whether it's on the private side or whether it's public side. It's how it gets spent and what it gets spent on. And I think there's absolutely no doubt in my mind this point that Graham was making about the additionality of it, because you can have $1 billion, you can have 10 billion, you can have 100 billion, but if you can spend it in a way that crowds in the private sector, that can find ways of demonstrating that actually the risk is less than that the private sector thinks, the private sector will then follow. Or if you can find ways of, as we did with the Ebola facility, of maybe sharing some of that risk to encourage the private sector in, then the private sector will come in as well. And I think I was particularly struck by something that Nick said about creating markets, because I think in a lot of these fragile situations, it's a very, very complex place. So going in with a big check does not create a new port project. You need to change the regulations, you need to understand the dynamics, you need to look thematically. And I think this point around looking thematically, whether it's healthcare or other things, and unpicking those various pieces, working with the likes of DFID, and creating that market in the same way that, as you said, the sort of the mobile telephones got created. If those markets can get created, the private sector will follow, and then the capital will follow, and you'll see the growth. So really, it's about how you catalyse that. And I think that's possibly what's some of the really exciting things that we've heard today.
Nick and or Rachel on these questions, but particularly I want to make sure you guys speak to Francophone Africa, but also to come back to this issue of, I was in Paris recently talking to AFD. They obviously have a focus on Francophone Africa, a comparative advantage. Do you both want to be in the same space? Can you come up with ways to divide where you focus to have especially good insight, contacts, and leverage in the communities that you work in?
Yeah, so let me take the questions quickly on the Africa list and then Francophone Africa. Thank you for mentioning the Africa list, because actually it's one of the things, having come to CDC, when I look at all the various, the many things we're doing, it's one of the things I guess I feel best about and proudest of. You know, we have assembled in, I guess, 5 countries now in Africa, a group of up to 200 different sort of senior business people from the 100 largest companies in those countries. We bring them together on a quarterly basis so they can network. We bring in speakers and so on so they can hopefully have a learning experience. Recently we organized the first coming together, sort of Pan-African coming together of that group. So it is, to be honest, the sort of thing that we do as a development finance institution. Those are the sort of things that separates us from mainstream financial institutions, because we're willing to invest in doing that sort of thing. And our ambition is over the next a couple of years to expand those 5 countries to 10 countries. On the question of Francophone Africa, it's a very good question. I mean, I guess it was one of the questions I asked when I first arrived. You know, what do we do in Francophone Africa? I mean, clearly, in any activity, commercial activity, but particularly investment, long-term relationships are really important. I went, for example, to Zambia. If you go to Zambia, you'll find that there's almost no asset in the country that hasn't been owned at some point in time in the last 70 years by CDC, and we have really deep roots in a country like that. And that comes from our heritage as a Commonwealth Development Corporation. We don't have those roots in Francophone Africa. We would certainly like to build them. We do have, you know, and I've met them, we have people working at CDC now who are French and speak French. And that's an important element of actually being able to build relationships there. So, so I hope over time that we will, you know, when we've been considering also where we might have people on the ground, and certainly to have somebody in that region to help us sort of accelerate our building of relationships there would be, I think, very important. So it's not any sort of, we do have comparative advantage in certain countries and not in others, but we need to work to develop those countries where we don't have that natural advantage.
Great. We're going to move to wrap up, but Rachel, did you want to say anything about those questions, or I will start with you on the wrap up?
Why don't you still?
Then I will
Because
start with you on the wrap up.
I think they've answered, although I mean, maybe I should say I'm aware that we didn't specifically answer the question about whether we have gender targets for the Africa list. And I think that I do want to acknowledge that question, because I think it's an important question. And I think it's something that we should take away and have a look at. The chairman is nodding. Yeah. So thank you.
Okay. So we're going to move to the final wrap up here. I think I hear bottles being decorked next door. So be aware of that in terms of the length of your response while all these good people wait to get something to eat. But seriously, maybe we'll just take a minute to 90 seconds each to go down the line, final reflections, thoughts, things that you desperately wanted to say but didn't get the chance to.
Well, first of all, thank you again for hosting us. Listen, I think we're very excited and very ambitious about this new strategy and everything that's in it. I mean, there's a heck of a lot of work to do, and we are going to work very closely with CDC to deliver it. I mean, I really do think that there's a lot in this strategy that is game-changing. It does feel, I think, in many places very different to what the other DFIs are doing. And I think the points that have been made about, you know, not just acting alone, but acting out in front in terms of showing leadership to the whole DFI community, that remains really important. And we are going to stay very ambitious in terms of what we ask for and secure from CDC. And part of that will be bringing the other DFIs into this space. I think part of the answer to the question about how can we get big impact is exactly what Graham just said. It's about the collaboration. And we have seen in other places, you know, we had the Syria conference last year when we launched the work in Jordan for a jobs compact, where the DFIs came together in a very impressive collaborative way of working to really deliver game-changing opportunities for refugees to work in Jordan. And it's that kind of ambitious, game-changing approach that we now think that CDC can deliver. out in front of the pack, but challenging the others to come with them. So that's
final. We've decided we're going to have one closing comment
Okay.
from CDC,
Okay.
and that's going to be
Okay.
our chairman.
Great. Daniel?
No, thank you. I mean, and thanks very much for what was a really interesting conversation. And I think it's been great to be here as part of the launch of the CDC strategy. I mean, let me echo just what I said before, which is I think to crack the sort of the development gap, if you like, to crack the billions to trillions agenda, this public-private partnership is really critical and important. And I think that's why it's encouraging to hear so much focus within the CDC next 5-year plan around mobilization of private sector funding, catalyzing and creating new markets. And I look forward to seeing how we can sort of combine both the grant capital and also the development capital that CDC has in this kind of blended finance approach that I think is very important to tackling some of these challenges. And this whole question about local currency, I think, is another big challenge that I think collectively the private and public sector can really work on together.
Great. So, Graham, last words to you.
So, first of all, on behalf of CDC, thank you very much, Alex, and you and the team for hosting this, and everybody in the room and online for showing the interest in what's an important day for us. It's important because it marks the end of 5 years of extraordinary change. Those charts that Nick showed, you know, under Diana's leadership, she's not here now, but a lot of the team who've done all that hard work, you know, we're really proud about that. But today's about the opportunities and the challenges ahead. And we are excited. We're excited by the opportunities, all the things that Nick talked about, from new forms of development impact, the new strategies, gender. There's just so much to do. We're also daunted by the challenge. The challenge because, you know, ourselves and our shareholder, everybody from DFID to Minister Bates, Minister Stewart, Priti Patel, Secretary of State, have really challenged us. And this is an ambitious program. And CDC is inherently difficult. Balancing development impact and financial return is a hard thing. Development, as everybody in this room knows, is a complex subject, and CDC and private sector development is no exception to that. So we know that this strategy won't be perfect for everybody, but what we really hope is that people can see as a result of all the time that we've spent with many stakeholders in Parliament, civil society, we've tried to make significant changes to how we've done things in the last 5 years for the future. Those challenges we are feeling as a board, on behalf of the board, positive. We've got a great CEO. We're delighted you joined, Nick, and the team who are here and also not here in Africa and Asia, where over the next 5 years we said we'll be building up our presence. We think are up for that challenge. There are 3 things that I really hope you've got from today. The first one is that we have no delusions of grandeur. We are only one small part of the development agenda. You know, a part of DFID's economic development agenda, which is, as Rachel said and Lord Bates said, is a part of the overall development agenda. And we see ourselves working together collaboratively with civil society and other actors to achieve the SDGs. Secondly, whilst making a return, a positive, sustainable return is inherent in our mission, our purpose is development impact. That is what motivates us institutionally, and it has done for 70 years, and personally. And the third thing is, as Nick said, I think very clearly, we want to be an open and a more open organisation than we've been in the past. Why? Because what we do is hard. We have made mistakes, we will make mistakes. Taking risks, as Lord Bates said, is part of our mission. And we know we have to earn stakeholders' trust. We're a long-term business. Next year will be our 70th year anniversary. Investments in CDC can last 10 years. And so if we're going to achieve our mission, we need to have all the support and all the feedback. When we make mistakes, please tell us. Send an email, call Nick, me. We want to learn. And together, as Lord Bates said, you know, we want to achieve our goal, which is making a lasting difference on people's lives. on behalf of the UK taxpayer.
Thank you a lot. You guys have been a terrific audience. I feel like we need to work on temperature control a little bit in the room, but hopefully you'll be able to cool down outside. But please join me in thanking a terrific panel. And if you have a burning question, the panelists are going to be here. We've got some food and drink outside. I strongly encourage you to stay, to enjoy it, and to ask them the really hard questions that you didn't get to in the discussion. Thanks, everybody.